everyone, and welcome into this week's encounter with Star Wars The Aftermath Life Debt by Chuck Wendig. If you are unfamiliar with what's going on, go ahead and click on the thing, and I'll take you back to the beginning of this playlist, in which we are discussing this book a couple of chapters at a time every week. We've had a lot of fun doing it. This is of course the second book in the trilogy. We did so with the first book in the trilogy, just titled Aftermath, and if you'd like to join us on our journey from that point, go ahead and click here and it will take you all the way back to the beginning. But with that, let's get into this week's discussion. We're going to talk about 26, 27, and 28. So chapter 26, we are fresh out of rescuing all of the people from the ship prison on Kashyyyk. And Nora and Han talk. Nora is letting Brenton, who is freshly back from the Matrix prison, talk to Timon and let them kind of get used to each other again as they work on fixing Mr. Bones. Nora and Han are kind of commiserating over family stuff, and they have a really good discussion. Han seems like he's both trying to console Nora through a weird situation, while also looking to be consoled himself, though he would never really admit that. But he's kind of talking to Nora about his own life situation, about how he knows that he has a wife and unborn child back home, and that he has these responsibilities, and he needs to be worried about his kid, not like go off across the galaxy and get shot and stuff, but that he also just has to do this, that he'll never be happy or good for them as a person if he doesn't go and do this. And now he has to rectify that. And Nora has kind of been going through something that's the same but different. She didn't know she had a husband again up until this point, but she has had a child, and the whole point of the first Aftermath book was Nora trying to juggle with being a soldier and being a mother, and how she kind of comes to handle this. And I really liked seeing Han and Nora connect at this point. And then when Nora is feeling at this point is like a failure. Yes, she found her husband and has now brought her family back together, but she found her husband by accident. She wasn't looking for Brenton, and in fact had kind of given up on ever finding him again and had started moving on with her life. She had started to see Wedge. I give Nora a hard time in these videos. I really do. She's not my favorite character in this book, but I can't knock her for the struggle that she's going through, because she did the absolute right thing in moving on. Her husband had been taken by the Empire well before Return of the Jedi, and hadn't serviced. There was no record of him, and she had to be good. She had to be, and I don't mean like morally good, but she had to be stable. She had to be mentally healthy for herself, for her son, for the New Republic. She had to be able to do all of these things, and she, in order to do that, had to let go of her husband. And now she's dealing with the guilt of having done that, and then finding him again. Of course, the true irony is if she had held on to him and never let go of him, she might not have even been put in the situation where she could find him again. So it's this kind of weird mental gymnastics that she's going through and trying to figure out, did she do the right thing? Did she do the right thing for the wrong reasons? And that's just a lot for one person to handle. This chapter is also kind of an important one for Jazz. So Jazz, of course, earlier in the book was all about, I'm only a bounty hunter for the money, and I care about the money, and I'm not actually a good person, even though we knew she was. And throughout the book, she's been kind of slowly becoming more openly good. And this is the episode where she really just stands up and says, I'm going to stay on Kashyyyk. I'm going to help the Wookiees. She references the beginning of the book where they went after that Imperial guy, but they left the slaver behind and didn't free any slaves, and that just hasn't sat well with her this entire book. And she's putting her foot down and saying, no, with Kashyyyk, I'm going to stay and finish the job and help people. And she's kind of realizing now that that's who she is, that she is one of the good guys. Another kind of interesting thing that happens here is Han gives Nora the Falcon to take all the refugees back, and he stays behind with Chewbacca on Kashyyyk. And it's an interesting thing to me that Han gives up the Falcon, because so often in Star Wars movies, books, comics, whatever, the Falcon is the most important thing to Han Solo. And so often we can't really see them be separated from each other. But I think what this book is really pointing out that, the Falcon is really secondary to Han, to Chewbacca. And that the Falcon is really something that he and Chewie have together. And he has Chewbacca now. And that's the thing that he wanted back so much, that he's willing to give the Falcon to help everyone else. And I think it's also interesting to kind of look at the Falcon as a part of Han's own self. And Han wants to help these refugees that he just rescued, and he wants to help Nora, and he wants to help all these people, and he wants to kind of give a piece of himself back to his family that he's left behind, but he has to stay and do this thing. But he can give the Falcon, at least temporarily, to Nora to send all these refugees back, to follow through on really rescuing them, and to at least send some sort of message to Leia. And he can do that by kind of giving up himself. And I kind of contrast this, and I'm sorry to kind of go to a different book for a second, but I've been reading the new Jedi Order series for another thing we're doing on this channel. And in that series, a very different thing happens. You know, events in it are 20 years past now. I guess for the sake of not spoiling it, in case you guys haven't read it, Han has lost something else very important to him, and has a very different story, and yet he still has a story where he's dealing with a lot of grief. And in it, he lets go of the Millennium Falcon. He stops flying the Falcon for a time. And I just think it's interesting how inseparable the two characters, the character of Han and the character of the Falcon, seem. And yet it is something that in so many Star Wars stories, Han has chosen to separate himself from, because it's a way of him kind of dealing with his own emotions. Chapter 27 is the Wexley family flying home. So we have Nora and Timon and Brenton, and they're all kind of flying in the ship. And this is a point where Nora realizes just how complicated it's going to be, because Brenton is talking about how much he missed his family, and he's, missed so much, and that, the war was won while he was in a coma, and he woke up and all of this stuff is going on, and Nora's a completely different person, and Timon's so much older. He feels like the galaxy moved on without him, and Timon says, we haven't moved on. This is, again, where we're going to go to the classic conflict of Nora and Timon. Timon hasn't moved on from his dad. Nora has. And I was talking earlier about how, Nora kind of did the right thing. She couldn't have ever known this was going to happen. The relationship between two significant others is very different than the relationship between a father and a son. Timon never really needs to move on from Brenton in order to grow up and be who he's going to be. And by that, I mean, children kind of inevitably have to hit a point in their life where they're not relying on their parents for everything anyway. So when you hit the point where you don't have that figure, you don't necessarily need to come to a point where you can have someone else in your life, I guess is the best way to put it. And maybe that doesn't even make sense, but at the same time, I feel like people have multiple parental figures in their life. I have my father, and I have a good relationship with my father, but I have other male role models that I look up to in the same way I have my mother, and I have other female role models that I look up to. And there's such a thing as fathers and father figures. You can have more than one of those at a time. I don't need to let go of my father to have another father figure in my life. But for Nora, if she wanted to have a relationship with someone, which is perfectly fine for her to want, she has to move on from the relationship she already had. Kind of staying in love with multiple significant others, at least for somebody like Nora, is very, very difficult. And so this is something that Timon is going to be too young to understand. It's going to be hard for him to understand that his mother would ever need to move on from his father, because it's just such a different place for him to be in. And this kind of foreshadows, again, some really intense stuff that's going to happen between all of these characters. And then, of course, at the end of the chapter, we see Wedge and Leia, and Wedge is disappointed because Nora has come home with her husband, though he's not bitter about it, he understands, and Leia is disappointed because no one has come home with her husband, and so that was just kind of an interesting juxtaposition there. Chapter 28, we end up back on Kashyyyk. Chewie is in charge, and this was a really cool dynamic. We're so used to Han Solo is brash, he doesn't listen to anyone, Han Solo does what Han Solo wants, and yet he's taking orders from Chewbacca, and he's fine with it. And if you mouth off to Chewbacca, you're going to hear from Han Solo. And I like showing that the relationship is really one of equals. So often Chewie seems to be second banana to Han, but it's just because that's their dynamic. Han is just happier being the captain, and Chewie is content to be at his side, but it's not from a place of Han thinking he's better than Chewie. It's, when the cards are on the table and Chewbacca's the better one to lead, Han is perfectly fine with letting Chewbacca be the one that leads, and I like seeing the balance of their friendship there. Han even said earlier in the book that he feels like he has a life debt to Chewbacca as much as Chewbacca has a life debt to Han, and they have this kind of cyclical nature in their friendship. Of course, Jazz and Jom are both there, and they're both dealing with the fact that they both really are developing real feelings for each other, and they're both mad at each other when they're putting each other in danger. And then I know Anfasubi, who's been in the comments a lot, always likes all of the fun little phrases in this book. And one of my favorites is was mentioned in this chapter, and that's mustache hole. We have Greybach, who was from Interlude 8 in Aftermath Prime. If you remember, there were the 3 slaves, and like there was a Rancor pin, and they opened the Rancor pin, and the Rancors attacked all the Imperials and stuff, and there was a Wookiee. This is the same Wookiee. So we're seeing somebody from one of the other interludes, who presumably is one of the refugees that Han contacted when he was going to go to Kashyyyk, and that's who he is in this book. But that's really what I have to say about this week. With this week's reading, thank you so much for continuing to be on this journey with me. We're going to have a big chunk of change to read next week, and it's only 2 chapters. We're going to read chapters 29 and 30, but 29 and 30 are like 60 pages, so be warned. But read chapters 29 and 30, and we will discuss those next week. Please leave me a comment letting me know what you've thought of the story so far. Follow us on all of the socials and come and talk to us on all of the places. Thank you again. I know I say this like 5 times a video, but honestly, I have so much fun doing the series with everyone every week, and I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about this next week. And yeah, I'll talk to you next week.